Fly the helicopter and I'll make your son my heir, laughed the millionaire, without knowing that the black woman was the owner. Fly this helicopter and I'll make your son the heir to my fortune. Richard Blackstone laughed, pointing to the aircraft parked on the terrace of his Manhattan penthouse. His words echoed through the luxurious surroundings as 42-year-old Victoria Williams stood motionless by the infinity pool. The party was in full swing. 50 guests from New York's elite watched the scene with that morbid interest that only the very rich feel when someone is about to be publicly humiliated. Victoria had arrived there as a helicopter mechanic hired for a routine inspection in the middle of Richard's birthday celebration. She never imagined that this simple maintenance job would turn into the cruelest humiliation she had ever witnessed. Richard, drunk with power and Dom Perignon champagne, had decided to turn a working woman into entertainment for his billionaire friends. Listen up, everyone. Richard clapped his hands, drawing attention. This lady here says she knows about helicopters. Apparently, tinkering with screws qualifies her to fly a $12 million aircraft. Cruel laughter filled the terrace. Victoria held her toolbox tightly. Her 20 years working with aircraft had taught her that some battles are won in silence. Watching the enemy reveal all their cards before showing her own. Sarah, dear, Richard turned to his wife. Do you believe someone like this would know how to distinguish a cyclic from a rudder pedal? More laughter. Sarah Blackstone, eternally young thanks to plastic surgery, whispered something to her friends that made them laugh even louder. My son works at the municipal airport, Victoria replied calmly, ignoring the condescending looks. He dreams of being a commercial pilot one day. Oh, how touching. Richard made an exaggerated grimace. A lovely dream for people like you. But let's be realistic, dear. Commercial piloting requires education, refinement, a certain social class. Victoria felt every word like a blade, but kept her expression serene. What Richard couldn't see was the calculated storm brewing behind those calm eyes. So, here's my proposal. Richard spread his arms theatrically. If you can take off in my helicopter and fly once around the building, I guarantee that your son will become the heir to 50% of my fortune, an $800 million deal. The silence that fell over the terrace was absolute. Even the waiters stopped serving drinks. And if I fail? Victoria asked, her voice betraying a genuine curiosity that made Richard smile even more mischievously. If you fail, you sign a document publicly admitting that people of your condition should not aspire beyond their natural limitations. It will be posted on all my social media accounts for my 2 million followers. Victoria looked at the helicopter, then at Richard, then at the 50 faces waiting for her response, with almost thirsty anticipation. For a moment, something that looked like vulnerability crossed her face, as if she were weighing the impossible weight of the challenge. But anyone looking more closely would have realized that it wasn't fear that made her hands hesitate over the toolbox. It was the restrained power of someone about to completely rewrite the rules of a game that others didn't even know they were losing. I accept, she said simply, and something in the quietness of her voice made some guests look at each other uncomfortably. Richard clapped his hands, ecstatic. Wonderful. Is anyone filming? I need to document this historic moment for posterity. If this story of prejudice and reversal touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of humiliation would become the catalyst for a revolution that would forever change the lives of everyone on that terrace. Richard was ecstatic. In his 60 years of life, few things gave him as much pleasure as seeing people know their place in the social hierarchy that he considered natural and unquestionable. Now, in front of 50 witnesses from New York's elite, he was about to deliver what he considered a necessary lesson in reality. Sarah, dear, record everything, he instructed his wife, who already had her cell phone in position. This will make perfect content for my YouTube channel. 2 million followers will love to see how the real world works. Victoria watched the commotion around her. With that same disconcerting calm, the guests formed a semicircle around the area where the helicopter was parked, their champagne glasses sparkling under the terrace lights. Some were already whispering bets about how long it would take her to give up. Before we begin this spectacle, Richard paused dramatically. I think it's only fair that everyone understands exactly what's at stake here. He walked over to Victoria, stopping uncomfortably close. This lady has been repairing helicopters for how many years now? 20 years, Victoria replied without flinching. 20 years, Richard repeated to the audience. 20 years of turning screws and changing oil. And now she has the audacity to think that qualifies her to fly an aircraft that costs more than most houses. Margaret Whitmore, the mayor's wife, whispered to her friend beside her, Richard is being too cruel, even by his standards. But her voice was drowned out by the laughter of the other guests. You know what bothers me the most, Richard continued, his voice taking on a more venomous tone. It's this arrogance disguised as humility. This pretense that hard work replaces education, class, birth. He gestured theatrically, as if fixing equipment is the same as commanding it. Victoria clenched her fists for a split second, a movement so subtle that only the most attentive observers noticed. At that moment, uninvited memories surfaced in her mind. Her 19-year-old son, Michael, working 2 jobs to pay for aviation school. The nights he spent studying aerodynamics while she reviewed mechanics manuals at the kitchen table. My son is going to be a pilot, she said, her voice cutting through the laughter. And he's going to fly for airlines that people like you will never be able to afford. The silence that followed was tense. Richard blinked momentarily, unsettled by the unexpected confidence of that statement. How touching, he recovered quickly. But dreams don't pay for flight school tuition. Do you have any idea what it costs to train a commercial pilot? $300,000 minimum. He turned to the guests. Imagine a woman who earns what, $40,000 a year, thinking she can afford an elite education for her son. Victoria felt every word like a blow. But something interesting happened. Instead of knocking her down, Richard's cruelty was feeding a flame she had kept under control for a long time. Her eyes fixed on a helicopter, not with nervousness, but with a familiarity that made some spectators wonder why she seemed so comfortable. James, Richard called to his personal assistant. Bring the papers I prepared. I want her to sign them before she tries to fly. He smiled maliciously. It's a simple document, just confirming that she understands the risks of attempting to fly without proper qualifications and that she assumes full responsibility for any accident. James brought a clipboard with several documents. Richard leafed through them with obvious satisfaction. There's also an interesting clause here, he continued. If you fail when you fail, you agree to record a video statement admitting that people of your background should not aspire beyond their natural abilities. Nothing personal, of course. Just social realism. What Richard couldn't see was that with every cruel word, something changed in the room. Marina Blackwood, billionaire, pharmaceutical executive, watched the scene with growing discomfort. Robert Chun, tech mogul, exchanged meaningful glances with his wife. There were limits to what even the elite considered acceptable. What if I do it? Victoria asked, her voice maintaining that unsettling calm. Impossible, Richard laughed. But hypothetically, if by some miracle you manage to take off and land without killing anyone, I honor my word. Your son becomes heir to 800 million. He paused. And I'll post a video on all my social media accounts, admitting I was wrong. Victoria picked up the pen and signed the documents without hesitation. The movement was so fluid, so devoid of tremor or hesitation that some guests began to wonder if perhaps they were About to witness something completely different from what they expected. Excellent. Richard clapped his hands. Now, before the show begins, anyone want to place bets? How long before she gives up? 30 seconds after trying to start the engine, shouted Thomas Bradford, owner of a hotel chain. I say she won't even try to start it, replied Patricia Wells. To a real estate empire. Victoria walked toward the helicopter, and that's when something extraordinary happened. Her steps changed. No longer the careful walk of an intimidated worker, but the confident movements of someone who knew exactly where she was going. She opened the aircraft door and examined the interior with eyes that seemed to know every instrument. For a moment, as she adjusted the pilot seat and tested the pedals, some of the more observant guests noticed something disturbing. She moved around the cabin as if she had done it 1,000 times before. Each new humiliation only fueled something inside her that her oppressors couldn't see. A silent strength nourished by the very injustice they tried to impose, turning their contempt into the exact fuel she needed to rewrite not only her story, but also everyone's understanding of power, privilege, and the dangerous consequences of underestimating someone whose true identity remained hidden beneath layers of prejudice and misguided expectations. Victoria adjusted her seat belt with precise movements that made Margaret Whitmore frown. There was something disturbingly familiar about the way her hands found each control without hesitation, as if that cockpit were familiar territory, rather than a hostile and unknown environment. This is taking too long, Richard shouted from the terrace, his patience evaporating along with some of his drunkenness. Have you changed your mind and want to give up? No one will blame you for recognizing your limitations. Victoria completely ignored the provocation. Her fingers danced over the navigation instruments, checking the altimeter, fuel gauge, and hydraulic systems. Each check was performed with a methodical precision of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times before. Then her cell phone vibrated. She quickly read a text message and for the first time since she had arrived on the terrace, a genuine smile crossed her face. Documentation confirmed. Everything ready for live broadcast. Good luck, VH. Margaret whispered to her husband, John. Look how she's handling the controls. That doesn't look amateurish. John Whitmore, who had flown small aircraft in his youth, watched Victoria's deftness in the cockpit with growing interest. Sarah, Richard called to his wife. Make sure you're recording in high resolution. I want every detail of her failure documented for posterity. Sarah complied, but something about Victoria's calm confidence made her uneasy. She had worked as a TV producer before marrying Richard and had developed an instinct for recognizing when a story was about to take an unexpected turn. Richard, intoxicated by power and the adrenaline rush of public cruelty, decided to heighten the humiliation even further. Listen up, everyone, he shouted, ensuring the attention of every guest. Since our amateur pilot is taking so long to figure out how to start the engine, how about we make this even more interesting? He pulled out his phone and opened his Instagram account, where 2 million followers awaited content. I'm live streaming this to my followers right now. The whole world will be able to witness this educational moment about social realism and inappropriate aspirations. What Richard didn't know was that at that very moment, Michael Williams, a 19-year-old aviation student and Victoria's son, was in the hangar at the municipal airport watching a live stream with his classmates. His fists were clenched, but a smile was growing on his face. He knew something that none of the people on that terrace knew. Mom, he whispered to the screen, show them who you really are. On the terrace, Victoria finished her pre-flight inspection with the same meticulousness her Air Force instructors had taught her 20 years ago. Yes, she had worked as a mechanic for 2 decades. But that wasn't the whole story. Victoria Williams had been a military helicopter Pilot for 8 years before leaving active duty to raise her son as a single mother. Marina Blackwood approached Robert Chun discreetly. "Something bothers me about this situation," she whispered. Her body language, the way she checks the instruments, she doesn't strike me as an amateur. Robert nodded, his years as a CEO having taught him to read people. Richard is making a mistake. Great business people don't get where they are by underestimating people, especially when those people take on impossible challenges with such calm. Thomas Bradford, owner of the hotel chain, consulted his Apple Watch. "It's been 15 minutes. For someone who doesn't know how to fly, she's spending too much time on technical procedures." Inside the helicopter, Victoria adjusted her headset and tuned into the air traffic control frequency. When her voice finally echoed over the radio, it had the military precision of her years of service. "Manhattan Control Tower, helicopter November 7 Alpha Charlie. Requesting clearance for local flight. Approximate duration 15 minutes. The response came immediately. "November 7, Alpha Charlie, you are cleared for local flight. Maintain a maximum altitude of 1,000 feet and report your position every 5 minutes. Some of the more attentive guests noticed the natural earnestness of that communication. Patricia Wells, real estate Aries, pulled her husband by the arm. "David, she just used professional aviation terminology. That's not luck or improvisation." Richard, oblivious to the murmurs of concern that were beginning to arise among his guests, continued his performance for his online followers. "Folks, you are about to witness a lesson. In reality, some people are born for certain positions in life, and others, well, others need to learn to accept their limitations." The comments on his live stream began to divide. While some supported his social experiment, others questioned the ethics of publicly humiliating a worker, but none of them suspected what was really about to happen. Victoria checked the flight controls one last time. Collective, cyclic rudder pedals. Every command responded perfectly under her experienced hands. It was like coming home after a long absence. Margaret Whitmore could no longer contain her concern. She approached Richard with determination. "Richard, I think you should reconsider this. Something tells me that this woman what?" Richard interrupted her irritably. "Margaret, you're being dramatic. She's just a mechanic trying to fly a sophisticated aircraft. What could possibly go wrong?" At that exact moment, the helicopter's engine roared to life. With a perfect roar, there was no hesitation, no failed attempts or wrong procedures. The engine started on the first try, smooth and professional, as if Victoria did this every day. Richard's smile faltered for the first time. The propellers began to spin with increasing speed, creating the characteristic wind that made all the guests instinctively step back, but Victoria remained calm inside the cabin, her hands performing the pre-takeoff checks with a fluency that only comes from years of experience. John Whitmore grabbed Richard's arm. "My God, Richard, I've flown for years, and I know when someone knows what they're doing. This woman, she has real training." For the first time since he had made his cruel proposal, Richard began to feel a twinge of uncertainty. He watched Victoria through the cockpit window, noting her professional concentration, her confident posture, her precise movements that left no room for error. "Impossible," he muttered to himself. But as the words left his mouth, something in the back of his mind, a small, persistent voice he had chosen to ignore, began to whisper that perhaps he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The helicopter was ready for takeoff. Victoria looked through the glass at Richard, her eyes meeting his. For a moment that seemed like an eternity, and in that look, he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. The absolute confidence of someone who not only knew how to fly, but was about to use that skill to completely rewrite the rules of a game he had started without knowing his true opponent. The helicopter rose from the terrace with a smoothness that made Richard's heart stop. There was no hesitation, no sudden movement or instability. Victoria lifted the aircraft as if it were a natural extension of her body, executing a takeoff that even professional pilots would consider flawless. "My God, John," Whitmore whispered, his years of aviation experience making him recognize genuine mastery. "Richard, this woman, she's a real pilot." Richard felt his legs go weak. The live broadcast continued, and in the comments on her Instagram account, the first technical observations began to appear. Users with aviation knowledge noted the precision of her movements, her professional radio communication, her ease with the controls. "This can't be happening," Richard muttered to himself, but his words were picked up by his cell phone's microphone. 2 million followers witnessed his confidence shatter in real time. Victoria executed a perfect turn around the building, maintaining constant altitude and controlled speed. Through the panoramic windows of the terrace, guests could see her flying with an ease that completely defied the narrative of humiliation that Richard had constructed. Margaret Whitmore approached Sarah Blackstone. "Sarah, did you know? Your expression tells me that something isn't right here." Sarah, who had worked in television, recognized when a story was about to break. "I don't know who she really is, but Richard just made a terrible mistake." In front of millions of people. In the live broadcast comments, the tide was quickly turning at aviation expert Ike. "Guys, this is professional level piloting. Who is this woman at?" "Helicopter pilot Lisa, 15 years in the business, and I can confirm she knows very well what she's doing at NYC_flight control. She communicated with us using perfect military terminology. That's not luck." Richard read the comments with growing horror. "Turn it off," he yelled at Sarah. "Turn off the broadcast now." "Richard, there are 2 million people watching," she replied, pale. "If I turn it off now, it will look like we're trying to hide something." At that moment, Victoria landed the helicopter with surgical precision. The landing was so smooth that the champagne glasses on the neighboring terraces didn't even rattle. She turned off the engine with the same professional methodicalness and calmly removed her headset. When she stepped out of the aircraft, her demeanor had completely changed. No longer the humiliated worker trying to survive, but the serene confidence of someone who had just demonstrated her competence before an audience of millions. Satisfied with the flight, Victoria asked, walking toward Richard with steady steps. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Around him, 50 guests from New York's elite watched him with a mixture of horror and embarrassment. The situation had completely reversed. Now, he was the one being evaluated and judged. "I fulfilled my part of the agreement," Victoria continued, her voice carrying an authority that